Okay, this video on the wild orchids that I went to see is I'm doing it differently and adding a soundtrack because there are some very interesting points that would be better said than put in pop-ups. It was an organised walk, organised by somebody from the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Nature Trust. Yes, I needed to go and see the orchids, so I took part in the organised walk, but that's not really my thing. I like to do these sort of things on my own. So I got there very early and did most of the filming prior to joining the others on the organised walk. And quite honestly, apart from in one instance, which I'll get to in a minute, the guy only pointed out what I'd already seen. So, it was still enjoyable, met up with some friends, we chatted as we went round, disturbing the peace and quiet of the woodland. But I will say at the beginning, the quality of the videos is poor. This camera would not focus properly on the tiny little orchid blooms amongst the undergrowth in the incredibly low light levels. We'd had a stormy night, everything was soaking wet, so it was nice and fresh and green, but wet underfoot and all that sort of stuff. And although the DSLR can be controlled, I haven't got the level of control on the video camera, but I now need to work on that, because if I get in situations like this again, I don't want the camera to let me down. It's good enough that it should have performed well, but it needed some help from me, and I didn't have that knowledge. So the videos are not as good. But I took some good stills, so we've still got some sort of shots of the actual blooms and things like that. So let's get going and have a look at a very, very special woodland. I'll just explain why it's special. It's a beechwood, English beech trees, and it's an ancient woodland on chalk-type soil. Now, there are many beechwoods that come into that category. Many, many. And I certainly don't even have to travel that far from home, because I was quite a long way from home. But over the millennia, whatever, there are a lot of fungi that have evolved in the soil in this beechwood. And it's that combination that makes this woodland special, especially in one particular orchid's case. And literally it's the combination of the two that have allowed such large populations of these four orchids to actually exist. You can literally go half a mile up the road to a wood that looks almost identical, and there are none of these orchids there. It's just this one place. And it's that association between the fungi, which are dependent on the beech, so that's where they live, in the soil around the base of the beech trees. The beech trees are not totally dependent on that fungi, but the fungi are dependent on the roots of the beech to exist. And the orchids have an association with that fungi, which is why they're found in this place. So let's go and have a look round the wood, and I'll sort of narrate it as I go along, and we'll see how we do. So this was a typical clearing, shall we say, the understory of the mature beech trees. And in amongst this very, very low vegetation were the first two orchids that I went to see, and these are Swordleaf Helleborine and White Helleborine. And I must admit, while I was filming, I didn't know the difference, so I thought if I just film everything I see, somebody will explain it later. Anyway, this was the first reasonable bloom, because some of them were going over. These are very, very delicate little white flowers with a yellow throat. If they were bigger, they would be reminiscent of our, tropical orchids, some of those that we grow. But pretty little things, just. And as I sort of looked round, they were everywhere. This is a rare orchid, so this is a special place. I was just really impressed by the sheer number of these blooms. Just sticking out of the ground, it was just a wonderful sight. As I say, I'll pan round in places, but the numbers of these I was impressed with. Now I can see why it's a special place. They were just everywhere. The difference between the two I'll explain when we get to the stills. I have I had actually already filmed both types, but I didn't know at the time. The difference is obvious once somebody tells you, but I didn't have that knowledge at the beginning. So yeah, I filmed around this clearing. I found out later I shouldn't have been in it because it's fenced off, but not from the way I came at it, it's not. I always like to burrow through the undergrowth and not take the paths. And I'd come into the back entrance of this clearing, so I didn't see the warning that you're not supposed to be there. There weren't any no Roger signs. It's as simple as that, you know. If I'm out in the woodlands, I walk where I want. And I didn't realise, you know, that some of these orchids are in the middle of the path, and you can already see some people have trampled on them. But yeah, lots of them, just everywhere you look. Now, this wood is managed. These clearings are maintained. They are cleared, and English Nature go round and count these orchids every year to monitor their numbers. You know, it really is that special a place. So. Yeah, that's the video of the first two that I was after. Sorry, focus, yeah, I did have trouble focusing. You know, it's just a pain in the backside. Okay, so looking at this one then, this is the Swordleaf Litella Breen. The difference is the leaves are longer and thinner, and the blooms open, because they're pollinated by insects. And therein lies the subtle difference. Yeah. So that's looking at one in situ, just poking up through the undergrowth with its flowers waving in the air, ready for the insect pollinators to come along and do their thing. You can just about see on this shot little brown spots appearing. We don't only get them on our tropical orchids in our homes and grow rooms, they appear on the wild ones as well. And these had apparently, according to the guy, these brown spots had appeared in the last couple of days because we've had rain. So they've got wet. So, you know, they're not at their best. They're not pristine blooms. But nonetheless, I was impressed. You know, I searched out and tried to find the best ones I could find. These were the two largest spikes right next to each other, but you can see the blooms are already fading at the base of the spikes, and brown spotting in places like that. So anyway, that one, relatively long thin leaves, and the leaves do not go up into the spike. So those are the traits: open blooms, long thin leaves, and the leaves stop at the first flower. Now this is the white helleborine. This is self-pollinated. It does not need insects, so the blooms don't open. They have a tiny little gap where the insects can crawl in and do their thing. But if you look on the flower spike, the leaves, they're shorter, and they carry on up the flower spike in amongst the flowers. Now, if these two were in separate places, I'd have a job to see that difference, but having somebody there to explain it for once was a bonus. So again, white helleborine, leaves travelling right up the stem, and blooms not open. Very, very rarely do those blooms open. The insects just crawl in and do their thing. And that's how they work. So that's the first two. That's two ticked off the list as far as I'm concerned, and was well pleased. Okay, this next one is tiny, and I mean tiny. This is the fly orchid, and it's a mimic. Its blooms mimic the pollinators to attract them in to do their devious work. You can see these little sticks with little yellow tops on them. That's where the people who monitor this woodland go round and mark the spot where they are, and you can see they've even cleared out around the base of the plant to give them their full chance to be pollinated. And I really did have trouble getting this camera to focus at all on these. They are so tiny, but luckily I got some decent stills. Well, reasonably decent. The tiniest of orchids, and I could imagine if these weren't spot marked or somebody didn't point them out to you, I don't think you'd see them. You'd have great trouble finding these, and I didn't ever expect to see any at all. So to find reasonable numbers in one place, again, absolutely well pleased, but I just could not get this camera to focus properly. but you get the general idea of how they grow and where they grow. As I say, they are mimics. We've got quite a few orchids like that mimic the pollinator. So there you can see a spike, in isolation, with the tiny little blooms. They're basically green sepals and petals, and the lip itself resembles the body shape and colouring of the pollinator, which is what attracts them in. They don't do the fragrance thing, they do the visual thing. So, totally different mechanism. There aren't a huge amount of orchids that work that way, but we do have quite a few in the UK. I found a nice little group where several spikes, were together, and the light was a tiny little bit better here, but still not good enough for that video to get a good shot. So I was lucky. If I hadn't had the DSLR and relied on the video, we wouldn't be looking at, the detail levels on these blooms. They are tiny. I'm well pleased with being able to tick these off. And the last one of the woodland orchids is totally different to most other orchids. This orchid has evolved to actually be a parasite, and it's parasitic on the fungi that live in the soil. And as such, it has no need for chlorophyll. It has no leaves and no green parts whatsoever. It just sticks out of the ground and it's brown, in amongst the brown leaves. Oh yeah, very easy to find. And you might wonder why I'm filming my car. This was the giggle. This is the one I didn't find on my own. This is where I changed my shoes and put my heavy walking boots on. And I didn't see that right under my nose. Now my excuse is I wasn't really looking yet, I was doing my shoes. But yeah, if these hadn't been pointed out to me, I may well have missed them. They were right where I parked, literally right on the edge of the path. And then there was a group of them just inside the woodland, but that odd one was right by the car door where I changed my shoes. You can just about make out the others. These are difficult to spot. Once you get your eye in, they become a little more obvious. But yeah, this group, bloom's just starting to go over, so next year I'll go 2 or 3 weeks earlier, and now I know where they are. They'll be in the same place next year. They're not going to suddenly migrate to a totally different place. But yeah, this is the bird's nest orchid, and no chlorophyll and a true parasite. If the fungi weren't there, this orchid couldn't exist. It helps germinate the seeds and support the plant throughout its life, and it puts the blooms up to produce seed and do it all over again. So very, very strange orchid. Not a really good still, because again this was in deep shade. Even the DSLR had trouble with this, but that's what they look like. A parasitic orchid, no chlorophyll, no leaves, no green parts whatsoever. The majority of the plant is living underground, and those spikes don't last long. That's the only bit that ever shows its nose above the ground. Very interesting orchid. So the next part of the day I decided to go on a few miles up the road to a very, very high spot, highest point on the South Downs in fact. So this was mainly to get some food and a drink and see if I could find a couple of butterflies. I didn't hold out a lot of hope. There was no sunshine and quite a breeze, and butterflies they're not on the wing. But this was the place. The hill is called Buster Hill. There's a radio station on the top, and this place is called Rake's Bottom. The rake is the large escarpment that sticks out the back of the hill, from the high point and gradually slopes down. But it forms a valley, and in the shelter of that valley, one of the butterflies I hoped to find, which was the Duke of Burgundy fritillary, but none were on the wing. There is a problem, an inherent problem with going down into a very, very deep valley. You've got to turn around and come back up again. There were several choices. This was one of them, and I looked at that path and the size of that hill and I thought, nah, I'm getting too old for this. So I chose to walk back up the valley. I had no choice. I had to get back to the car. And this is the first hill that beat me. I had to sit down on many occasions. This was so steep I couldn't put my feet flat on the ground. I was walking up on the tips of my toes. I hurt a bit today as a consequence. That was a hard hill to climb. Lesson learnt. If you go down a steep hill, you've got to turn round and get back up again somehow. Either that or do about a 3-mile detour to get back to the car. Anyway, back near the car park, definitely a theme coming here. I did find a couple of orchids. These are common spotted orchids, and they're quite variable. They can be almost white to quite a deep purple, and they can have spikes that are short and dumpy and very squat plants to quite tall plants, but they get their name from their spotty leaves rather than anything to do with the blooms. And this was one just in isolation, quite near the place where I got my sandwich and a coffee. Yeah, I mean, they're very attractive blooms, but like most of the English orchids, the UK orchids, they're tiny. And they tend to have, this is more the typical shape. You know, it's a spike sticking up out of the grass or the undergrowth with lots and lots of blooms on that are tiny. And identification can become difficult because a lot of these are beginning to hybridize with neighbouring orchids, and the hybrids are getting difficult to actually identify. But I did find a nice group of them, literally on the track that leads to the car park. Seems that all the best things I saw today were where the cars go rather than out in the open spaces. But yeah, I mean, I did find a few orchids. No sign of the butterflies. The other one was the grizzled skipper. That can be found in many places, but the Duke of Burgundy, or His Highness, as is known in the trade, the numbers are depleting badly. Nobody really knows why, but the numbers are dropping off badly, and I've virtually missed my window to film that this year. They're coming to the end of their flight season. But I ended the day with some orchids and a long drive home, and just as I got home the sun decided to come out. Yeah, smashing. Don't we love our weather forecasts? But a good day. Good group of friends, some good orchids, a good day. Well pleased.